This is part 2 of this presentation. Alexander Shlyapnikov's personal and political life in the period following the Congress of Victors and ending in his execution in 1937 was framed by 2 internal exiles and 2 sets of arrests, interrogations, and periods of imprisonment. The Great Terror of 1936-8 spiraled outward to encompass not only communists like Shlyapnikov, but entire social and ethnic categories, resulting in 2.5 million arrests and around 682,000 executions. Archives have yielded much data about the numbers of people involved, Stalin's role in guiding the terror, the NKVD's implementation of it, the responses of ordinary people and Gulag operations, yet there are still unilluminated aspects of this complex and confusing event. Memoirs published in the West before the collapse of the USSR and documents released subsequently provide diverse perspectives on the Great Terror. Yevgenia Ginsburg survived arrest, interrogation, and forced labor in the harsh Arctic North to write a 2-part memoir, Journey into the Whirlwind and In the Whirlwind, describing the arbitrary, mad brutality of the Great Terror. But the archetype of the Old Bolshevik who perished in those years is the character Nicholas Rubashov in Arthur Koestler's 1940 novel, Darkness at Noon. Interrogators employed the logic of party loyalty to persuade him to confess to outlandish crimes at a public trial. Koestler called Rubashov a synthesis of the Old Bolsheviks who confessed in the 1936-38 show trials. These included Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky supporter Karl Radek, and Nikolai Bukharin, who was identified with the new economic policy, and several dozen others. Koestler's compelling depiction of Rubashov's psychological state convinced many that it represented how all Old Bolsheviks felt towards their party. Casting doubt on Koestler's depiction, U.S. scholar Stephen F. Cohen, in his 1980 biography of Bukharin, contended that Bukharin employed double talk and veiled allusions to subvert charges at his trial. In a 1995 book about the new industrial city Magnitogorsk, historian Stephen Kotkin argued for the existence of a Stalinist discourse, which he called Speaking Bolshevik. Influenced by Kotkin, historians Igal Halfin and Jochen Helbeck studied Soviet Communist internalization of Stalinist discourse. Historicizing Koestler's literary approach, Halfin argued in his 2009 study of Leningrad University during the terror that a radical instrumentalization of their subjectivities rendered party members selfless. End quote. Without a sense of self, one could carry out any measures the party deemed necessary. Halfin relied for evidence on the published show trial testimonies of the Old Bolsheviks and unpublished confessions by younger communists. Given the apparent solidity of his case, which he had been developing since a 1999 book, and the rich store of documents released from archives after the 1991 collapse of the USSR, historians shifted their attention towards the mass nature of the terror. Although Wendy Goldman's 2011 book on the repression in Moscow factories returned focus to individuals' motives to resist or facilitate escalating terror. My argument that Old Bolshevik responses to terror varied is based on evidence including Shlyapnikov's diary, his personal correspondence, and original NKVD interrogation protocols, all of which I found in the Central Archive of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. Thousands of Old Bolsheviks who perished in the terror never came to public trial. Shlyapnikov and other key figures tried secretly on the case of the Moscow workers' opposition did not regard self-slander as in the party's interest. Under interrogation, Shlyapnikov employed logic and denial to contest the 1935 charges of anti-Soviet agitation and counter-revolutionary organization and the charge of terrorism added in 1936. He largely resisted implicating others in crimes against the Soviet state. Challenging Stalinist expectations for proper communist behavior, he preserved his own sense of self as a Bolshevik. A brief exile to the far north in March 1934 preceded Shlyapnikov's arrest in 1935 and illustrates the tenuous position former oppositionists occupied before the murder of Sergei Kirov. By Politburo order in 1930, construction began on the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal, BBK or BBK, which was completed by summer 1933. Plagued by shortages of high-quality construction materials, especially metal, the canal never achieved the goals assigned to it. Too shallow for large vessels, it was not even of strategic value. Nevertheless, BBK served as the prototype for large-scale Soviet forced labor under political police direction. In 1934, construction continued on other projects. Aside from economic goals, BBK and similar projects had an ancillary goal, the reforging, or perikovka, of prisoners, who by means of hard physical labor would transform into the new Soviet man. The term reforging originates in metallurgy. The human body and mind were to compensate in some ways for insufficient metals and other materials available for construction. Spiritual regeneration would offset material disadvantages or backwardness. Soviet leaders called upon Shlyapnikov, the old Bolshevik metal worker, to participate in the BBK project soon after his purge from the party. But his assignment took the form of administrative exile. He had been seeking work for which he required the party's permission, even though he had been purged from it in 1933. In early March of 1934, job negotiations took an ominous turn. On March 7th, Shlyapnikov was unexpectedly instructed to leave for Siberia within 48 hours. Astounded, he interpreted this as a sentence of exile. Appeals to old comrades in the Politburo, Vyacheslav Molotov, Mikhail Kalinin, and Klim Voroshilov, yielded no positive outcome. On March 13th, the OGPU secret political section relayed to him orders to depart Moscow within 3 days for a work assignment at BBK. Shlyapnikov found his status strange and confusing, since he had not been arrested, yet he had been placed under police authority. The OGPU had gradually expanded its duties beyond policing to include economic administration, but Shlyapnikov had no experience with its new powers. He inquired about his legal status and other matters, but received ambiguous answers. He was not deprived of civil rights, as he was considered neither an exile nor a prisoner, and would be assigned administrative work on site. He received a travel allowance of 500 rubles and was expected to arrange his travel himself. Having seen his doctor, he departed by train just after midnight on March 20th. During his journey to the north, exile, and return, he maintained a diary, which the NKVD later used in its interrogations of him. At his destination, the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal forced labor complex, he was disturbed to find numerous old acquaintances among the prisoners. In his diary, he expressed his disbelief in the charges against them, and was emotionally drained by the encounters. Assigned to operational planning, Shlyapnikov shared an office with camp administrative staff, and so witnessed numerous interactions among camp personnel. Writing in his diary, he enclosed in ironic quotation marks typical Stalinist terms such as reforging spoiled human material into new people. Shlyapnikov's prior experience working for the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, RSFSR, had acquainted him with flaws of the Soviet economy that he also uncovered during his research into camp operations. Among these were incomplete and inaccurate data that were further distorted as they passed up the command chain, yielding an exaggeratedly optimistic perspective, which was a fundamental flaw in the Stalinist economy. He proposed a project for gathering more accurate and comprehensive data. Higher-ups approved, but Shlyapnikov was ordered to return to Moscow before he could commence work. Alone in his sleeping compartment on the train, his emotions spilled onto the pages of his diary as he described himself badgered and persecuted by people who hijacked leadership of Leninism and of the party, strutting their achievements against the background of world reaction, but carefully hiding the true poverty of the working class and of collective farmers. Although Shlyapnikov remained in Moscow until his arrest on January 1, 1935, he did not obtain new employment, but instead continued writing his memoirs. He paid close attention to international events in 1934. Since 1919, he had suffered from Meniere's illness, which caused vertigo, tinnitus, and periodic deafness, and it had worsened during exile, so he applied to the Council of People's Commissars, Sovnarkom for a pension, but received no answer. All those to whom he appealed told him that only Stalin could decide his lot. So he wrote to Stalin in late November, neither lauding Stalin nor apologizing for anything he had done. He insisted on his indisputable right to a pension and requested permission to travel to France for medical treatment. He thereby hoped to restore his ability to work on behalf of the revolutionary proletarian cause. Stalin never responded to Shlyapnikov's November 1934 appeal. A few days after it was sent, Sergei Kirov was murdered by Leonid Nikolaev. Immediately after the murder, Stalin authored a Politburo decree accelerating trials of those charged with terrorism, the law of December 1, 1934. He followed this up with arrests of Zinoviev's associates in Leningrad, then of Zinoviev and Kamenev in mid-December 1934. By February 1935, more than 1,000 people had been arrested on the case of the Kirov murder. NKVD officers arrested Shlyapnikov at his dacha overnight on January 1st to 2nd, 1935. They searched his dacha and Moscow apartment and confiscated his diary and personal correspondence. Shlyapnikov was detained at the Lubyanka. His NKVD interrogators wrote protocols based on their questions and Shlyapnikov's answers. He signed the protocols, and he made handwritten corrections to them. The NKVD interrogators of 1935-7 were around 30 years old, usually lacked higher education, and knew only the party history that they intensively studied in distorted texts. They had no special training in interrogation, but were selected on the basis of apparent talent. Most were men, but some were women. Evidence at this stage consisted of Shlyapnikov's 1934 diary and his correspondence with his friend and comrade Sergei Medvedev, also a former member of the workers' opposition. Medvedev was in internal exile in the BBK complex through 1934. He was brought back to Moscow, however, in early 1935. January. The interrogator insisted that the diary contained counter-revolutionary anti-party evaluations, such as Shlyapnikov's description of Leningrad working-class women and children as having gaunt faces and pale bloodless lips, and his reference to low wage rates foisted on workers and intensified exploitation. Shlyapnikov said that he was just writing what he had seen in Leningrad. Asked why he had not passed to higher authorities Medvedev's August 1934 letter, which the interrogator said contained anti-party evaluations, Shlyapnikov retorted that he assumed the letter had passed through censors, and thus was known to those who were supposed to know about it. In the face of Shlyapnikov's denials, the NKVD acquired testimony against him from others. Georgy Safarov, accused as a Zinovievist, testified that he and Shlyapnikov had discussed conducting joint counter-revolutionary work in the previous 3 years. Shlyapnikov denied this. Nikolai Sergeyevsky had informed about a meeting at Shlyapnikov's apartment on December 6, 1934, on the day of Kirov's burial. Shlyapnikov denied it was a meeting of his organization, only a gathering of comrades who came for a cup of tea. He admitted that they discussed Kirov's murder and that he, Shlyapnikov, had said, no matter the murderer's exact motives, personal or political, the murder had a political character, since Comrade Kirov was a member of the Politburo and of the government. Investigators tried to establish that Shlyapnikov had led a counter-revolutionary organization with affiliates outside Moscow, and they tried to determine its membership from him. He denied that his meetings and correspondence with comrades had any organizational character. He emphasized, I do not construct my relations with comrades on the principle of their participation or non-participation in the former workers' opposition. Interrogators sought signs of conspiracy and pressed him as to how or from whom someone visiting from Rostov learned his home address in December 1934. Shlyapnikov pointed out that his visitor could have simply looked it up in the Moscow telephone book. Interrogators were bent on describing a well-organized counter-revolutionary organization with a Moscow center, subgroups, and affiliates in other cities. Moreover, they implicated Shlyapnikov of having entered into a bloc with Zinoviev. Shlyapnikov insisted that those who testified against him were lying. This is the end of part 2. There will be a part 3.